Good morning, everyone. I am Marcia Lacco with the Department of Environmental Quality, and I will be your session moderator. I want to welcome you to our discussion on demystifying cleaning in the age of COVID-19, best management practices for the business community. With North Carolina businesses facing a myriad of decisions and actions in response to COVID-19, this event was created to provide you with timely information. Hopefully, what you learned today will assist you and your organization to make informed decisions as North Carolina continues or returns to work. Today's event is hosted by staff from the Department of Environmental Quality's Environmental Stewardship Initiative and the North Carolina Department of Labor's Occupational Safety and Health Division. We are also partnering with DEQ's Division of Waste Management and the Department of Health and Human Services Division of Public Health. I want to thank our presenters and panelists for taking time from their schedules to participate. Finally, we'd like to thank DEQ's Waste Reduction Partners and the Land of Sky Regional Council for hosting the event on GoToWebinar. Just a few housekeeping items. If you have any technical difficulties, please give Terry Albrecht a call and he can help you troubleshoot. His number is listed on the slide, so you might want to jot it down. If you have audio issues using the audio through your computer, you can use your telephone by switching the audio selection. Just go to the audio tab in the webinar controls box and click phone. A phone number and the code will then be shown for you to use to access the webinar. This info is also contained in the webinar invite you received. To prevent feedback and unintended background noise, all attendees will be muted throughout the webinar. We are recording today's session and we'll send a link to the recording and copies of the slides to all registered attendees. Feel free to share these. We encourage you to submit your questions anytime during the webinar. We'll be sharing these questions with our panelists during our question and answer session. So before we get started, we're going to conduct a couple of polls to learn a little more about our audience. The first poll asks you to identify the type of business that you represent. Okay, so I've closed the poll and it looks like about 30% are government, 30% are manufacturing and industry, 19% are commercial business, 14% are other, and we have about 8% that are school or university. Okay, our next poll is going to ask you to share the current operating status of your business or organization. All right, so it looks about 35% of the audience is operating normally and 35% are partially closed. 22% are entirely closed to the, 22% are closed to the public, whereas 6% are closed completely. And we have 4% that have higher than normal operations. Okay, thank you everyone for participating in those polls. All right. So we are now going to transition into our speakers. And our first speaker is going to be Andy Sterling. It gives me great pleasure to introduce him. He is with the Health and Safety Specialist with the North Carolina Department of Labor's Safety. Safety and Health Division, Bureau of Education, Training, and Technical Assistance. Andy has over 20 years of experience in industrial hygiene in the chemical industry. In his role as a health education specialist, he instructs many widely varied topics from chemical hygiene and process safety management to crane inspections and steel erection. He began his career as an R&D process chemist in the field of polymer chemistry and has industrial experience in the pulp and paper industry. For fun, Andy enjoys traveling and plays Australian rules football for the North Carolina Tigers in the US AFL. Andy, you should have presenter rights now.
Okay, great. So we're in good shape there. So welcome everybody. I appreciate you being here. We're going to kick this off with talking about the demystifying cleaning in the age of coronavirus. So hopefully this will work out nice and smooth. Let's see. Can everybody see my slides? Hopefully you can. There we go. So the first question is, what is coronavirus? So coronavirus, it's a large family of viruses that cause illnesses from colds to severe diseases. And the reason it's called a coronavirus is because it looks like a crown. So corona is Latin for crown. There are a lot of different types of coronaviruses. There's gastrointestinal and respiratory, which is what this one is. Respiratory viruses can be anywhere from just a common cold to something like pneumonia. There are different classes and different types of viruses, right? So generally, most of your coronaviruses are mild, but sometimes they're severe. And in this case, this one happens to be much more severe and it attacks the respiratory system. Because it was a new virus that they discovered, they call it a novel coronavirus, and it was discovered in 2019. That's why it's called COVID-19. It has nothing to do with some sort of sequential numeration system. It's just because it was discovered in 2019, all right? So there's a lot of similarities and symptoms, okay, with the flu, but coronavirus is not the flu. So any of your friends or coworkers or anywhere you've seen this where they're like, oh, it's just like the flu. No, it's not. It's not at all, okay? So how is it different? Well, number one, it's a completely different virus, all right? It's far more deadly. Every year in this country, we have between 9.3 and 41 million cases of the flu, with 12,000 to 61,000 fatalities in the US. That's on average. So far with COVID-19, with all the quarantine and the stringent contamination measures that we've taken, cleaning things and doing all this other stuff and keeping people in their home, we've still had, we're up to like 1.1 million cases, even with all of that. And, we've had well over 60,000 deaths. So you can see it's far more deadly. The virus itself, it's not a living organism. It's a protein molecule. And DNA, you can see the green squiggly thing in the center. All right, that's genetic material. It's covered by a lipid layer. A lipid is a fat, and it requires a host cell to actually function. So the virus itself, not living. It has to have a function, a host to function that it infects. And so the virus enters the cell through a protein called an ACE2, which is angiotensin converting enzyme. It enters the cell, and we see these enzymes are on the lungs, throats, intestinal tracts. That's why a lot of the times with the symptoms of this virus, you'll see them specifically to those organs. They're also, once it enters those cells, now it turns into aggressor cells and multiplier cells, and that's what actually causes the virus itself to propagate. So when we look at the specifics of COVID-19, there's, like I said, most of your coronaviruses are pretty mild, and over the last several years, we've seen several of these. SARS in 2003, which is severe acute respiratory syndrome. as well as MERS, which is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. We saw a lot of our soldiers came home with that from the Gulf War. When we look at this new or novel coronavirus, a lot of the taxonomy on it that was done when scientists saw what the genome sequence was of this specific virus, they saw that it was very similar to SARS. And so they named it SARS-CoV-2. But the World Health Organization, to avoid any sort of confusion, they are the ones that named it COVID-19 because it seemed like a pretty straightforward, easy name so people wouldn't get it confused with SARS, which happened in 2003. So what we know about the virus is that it has an incubation period of 1 to 14 days. It can be transferred by asymptomatic carrier. What that means is essentially you can have the disease and not show any symptoms. You can look absolutely perfectly healthy, no worries in the world, and yet you can still transmit it to other folks. It is transferred by droplets that are sprayed by individuals. Like in the old days, when you were a little kid, you used to tell your friends, you'd be like, hey man, say it, don't spray it. Well, that's the thing. It's the spraying it part. And, a lot of people, even the best speakers still will, have a little bit of spittle will come out of their mouth when they talk. So it's these droplets. These droplets are aerosolized when you speak. They get into the air, and this is the big difference. They can maintain their virility in the air for up to 3 hours. So that means, with something like a flu or cold or some other illness, it takes somebody that is sick and wheezing and coughing and sneezing all over you for you to catch it. In this case, that person can occupy a space, right? Like a bathroom stall or a small room or a closet or anything else. And those droplets can remain in there and then they're gone. You walk in an hour or two later and shazam, now you've got it, right? It can be transmitted from animals, human to human, human to animal. There's no treatment for this now. There's no vaccine. There are supportive measures. There are a couple of compounds, remdesivir, which is used for Ebola, that has shown some promise, meaning patients recover a little bit quicker, about 13% quicker, okay? But still, not great. The symptoms, there's fever, cough, shortness of breath. Again, those all have to do with respiratory, chills, shaking with chills, muscle pain, headache, sore throat, and a loss of taste or smell. Now, a lot of people get sick from this. A lot of people do not get sick from this. The people that get sick from this, some of them recover and they can recover at home. Many of them have to be hospitalized. Ones that get hospitalized, as this develops further, it ends up can turn to pneumonia, sepsis, kidney failure. There's a lot of different things, different ways that this ends up killing someone. Now, again, the virus is a protein molecule. It's not a living organism, so it cannot be killed, but it will decay on its own. And that degradation depends on temperature, humidity, and the type of material where it's living, right? So when we talk about things that are contaminated, essentially, this is a slide that we use in our bloodborne pathogen series. In fact, a lot of these slides are. And with bloodborne pathogens, it's just we look at things and we anticipate blood or other potentially infectious material on an item or a surface. And this is where we come to this, which is potentially infectious material. So contaminated means if there's a potential for droplets containing the virus to be present. So this can be metal surfaces like doorknobs, wood, wooden furniture, decking, plastics like a plastic bottle, subway seats, bus seats, stainless steel, cardboard, copper, aluminum, glass, ceramics, you name it. And all of these have different dwell times depending on the exposure that they have and how long the particles, what the volume of particles are, and also the conditions that it's in. So we look at exposure, which is the one thing we're concerned about. We're going back to work. We have employees. What is their exposure? So within that, that's the first thing you have to ask, your question. So is the activity that you're doing, are you going to be indoors or are you going to be outdoors? So some folks, like folks that work in construction or if you work in parks and recs, or you're a forest ranger, something like that, you're going to be involved in outdoor activities. And coronaviruses, all coronaviruses, they naturally die when exposed to heat and sunlight. So your social distancing and your exposure protocols, like wearing a mask and gloves and things, those things all still apply. Also, if you see people that are sick, have them go home. Have them go home. This is not the time to say, hey, I'm going to be strong and I'm going to work through this, right? No, you need to go home because you're exposing other people, and that's what you do not want to do. Now, if you're working indoors, that's a whole nother situation. So if you're working indoors and that area has been unoccupied for the last 7 days or longer, meaning you close the door and nobody else has been in there since you closed that door, and that was 7 days ago, 7 weeks ago, a month ago, whatever. As long as nobody has been in there, then you're fine. You don't have to worry about, the virus being there, because the virus will not last longer than 7 days on any surface. So you're going to have a much greater chance of people coughing and sneezing due to dust and pollen and cobwebs than you are with COVID-19. However, if that area has been occupied with anybody, janitor, cleaning people, you go in to check the mail. Oh, it's just, our secretary, she goes in and grabs the mail every day. That's exposure. At that point, you're going to have to clean and decontaminate. So what are methods of compliance? Well, here you can see 4, and we're going to go into these, and this is going to give us a better idea of how we actually comply with this. So the first thing would be universal precautions. This is an approach to infection control. It originated with the CDC, and essentially universal precautions and standard precautions, which is actually you can use in lieu of universal precautions. You treat all body fluids as potentially infectious, not just those covered by universal precautions, which would be human blood and blood fluids and other things that we know to be pathogens. You just treat all body fluids, everything. That's standard precaution. Just treat everything as though it's potentially infectious. Now, with engineering, one thing that is important to remember is that if you're in a confined space, there's more of a concentration of the virus there. So the more open or naturally ventilated, and notice I said naturally ventilated, the less concentration you're going to have. So remember, you come into a building for the first time, don't just start up ceiling fans and do all that stuff. Clean everything up, then start your ceiling fans. If you have, remember, these particles can float in the air for up to 3 hours and can lodge in your nose. That's why, again, why this virus is so dangerous. The virus is very stable in cold, moist, and dark conditions. So air conditioners and houses and cars, those are especially effective for harboring and transporting the virus. Now, typically with your car, it gets very hot and inside, and we don't really have to worry so much about moisture building up in our air conditioning system after we shut it off. Most of it evaporates. However, in a building, with the lights off and everything else, a lot of times, you can have condensation develop, and this can cause other things because, when you have a wet condition like that, you can have things like Legionella and other bacteria will start to propagate in that. And we've seen that with COVID-19, it can be transferred through an air conditioning system. There was a case in China where you had 3 family clusters that were under air conditioning vents, and somebody that had the disease was actually near an intake. They were sick, and it transmitted it to the other 3 families that were under the vents. So cleaning your air conditioning systems is probably a good idea, and also keeping folks away from things like intakes and outlets. So one of the big things that we talk about is altering behaviors. This is a big part of our life now, right? Because things aren't like they've always been. Starting to get warm, and you usually see people going out and running around and doing all kinds of stuff. And we have our art festivals and all that stuff downtown. So you have a whole ton of people out there. And with those folks, you have a lot of exposure. That's why we talk about social distancing and keeping away from each other. Well, another big one is washing hands. So people say, oh, how can washing hands make such a difference? It makes a huge difference. The biggest medical breakthrough in history, even to this day, was in the mid-19th century. Surgeons in Europe learned to wash their hands. And some surgeons here in the United States read those medical journals and they said, hey, let's try this whole crazy washing hands thing between patients. And they did, and guess what? Infection rates plummeted. But it really took until the turn of the 20th century before washing your hands before surgery and touching a patient really became a universal practice in the United States. Now, they have been doing this in Europe and all over the world for 50 years before finally in the US we adopted it and started doing it here. Now, why washing hands? Well, you need to wash hands because scrubbing your hands will, again, break that lipid layer. You create foam. This is the reason why they say sing the happy birthday song, right? For 20 seconds, you increase foam. That helps to destroy that lipid layer and degrade the actual protein and wash it off. So when do we wash hands? Well, not just after the bathroom. And believe me, you should go, wash your hands after using the bathroom. Absolutely. You should also wash them before putting on PPE, taking off PPE, after handling trash cans or any other receptacle like that. Wearing a face mask helps very much. That's a new work altered behavior, right? Wearing a face mask. It protects others, but it also protects the wearer from touching his face, right? Because we touch our face 12 to 15 times an hour. Keep your break rooms clean. Keep your bathrooms clean. Clean them more regular than you normally would. Remember, high touch surfaces is how we spread this. Now, my slide's not progressing.
Andy, are you still having issues?
Yeah, I can't get the slide to go to the next slide.
Okay, I will take back.
Oh, I got it.
Okay.
I don't know what happened.
Okay.
So washing hands, again, wash after using the bathroom. Don't judge a book by its cover. There's a lot of seemingly clean people out there, well-dressed, nice, well-mannered people, and they don't wash their hands after using the bathroom. So be very careful about that. Wash your hands after blowing your nose, after wiping your nose. Again, between tasks, before eating, before smoking, before drinking, right? After handling money, absolutely wash your hands. Money is probably one of the nastiest things out there that you can touch. So again, when you're washing and cleaning your hands, a lot of people say, hey, why not just use hand sanitizer? Well, you can, but I'm going to tell you why this is so important. So you think about that virus, right? Think about it. It's got a lipid layer that you have to destroy. The virus itself is very fragile, and it's depending on that thin outer layer to protect it. So to destroy the virus, think of it like an M&M, right? So to get to that chocolatey center inside, you got to dissolve that candy shell. So how do you do that? Well, washing and scrubbing will do that because it cuts the fat. That's the reason why you scrub for 20 seconds. You make a lot of foam that dissolves that layer. Heat also melts fat. So using water above 25 degrees centigrade for washing your clothes, And 25 degrees centigrade is about 80 degrees, right? So pretty tepid water. Washing hands, clothes, anything that you're washing, using hot water definitely helps, okay? It makes more foam, and that makes it even more useful, all right? Now, alcohol. A lot of people will say, well, why can't I use alcohol? Alcohol or any mixture of alcohol that's over 65% alcohol dissolves fat. 65%, all right? I'll say it again, 65%, all right? Especially, hand sanitizer, that's over 65%. So it has to be at least 65%. This is the reason why if you wash your hands with vodka or some other liquor, that's just a waste of good liquor. It does nothing to clean your hands. Listerine will work, but it has to be over 65%. So 65% is that key. Now, you wash your hands a lot. It's important to moisturize your hands, because if your hands and your skin dry out, then you can have micro cracks. And again, that's where the virus can hang out. Keeping your nails short is also important, right? Those super big, long, giant nails or Lee press-on nails, those kinds of things, they can harbor virus. So when we have PPE, right, we want to make sure we've got it in all different sizes. One size fits most, typically doesn't fit large hands. I know I've got one size fit most gloves, they don't fit at all, okay? So remember, large and extra large gloves. If you've got employees, especially if you've got men or you got people with big hands, right, they need to have large or extra large gloves. Small people with small hands can use large gloves, but large people cannot use smaller gloves. They can't get them over their fingers. You see a mask, remember that the PPE needs to be serviceable and worn correctly. It needs to go over your mouth and your nose, right? So think Old West bank robber, all right? Think Old West bank robber, not Old West hostage. It's not a gag. Don't just cram it in your mouth and leave your nose unprotected. Then it will do nothing, all right? It needs to go over your nose and your mouth. Now, things like an N95, what they do is they capture particles in the air like dust, aerosols, mist, droplets. These are the things that they're trying to capture. Now, a lot of people have said, what is an N95 respirator exactly? Well, the N represents whether or not it's oil resistant. An N means no, it's not oil resistant. An R means it has some resistance. And a P means it's oil proof. So the 95, you can have 95, 99, or 100. This is the percentage of particles that it blocks. Doesn't block any gases or vapors, but it works perfect for this. Now, this particular model has a little air valve on the outside, and that keeps it from fogging up. Now, some people have asked, hey, can I use this? And why isn't this good out in public? Remember, when you're wearing a mask in public, you're protecting others from you. So if you're an asymptomatic carrier and you're wearing a mask and you're breathing through it, your particles are still escaping. In a hospital setting, those people are tested regularly, so we know that, whether or not they have the virus. And again, we take precautions for that. They're wearing surgical masks which don't have this vent. Now with gloves create a barrier between your hands and whatever you're handling. Remember, some people have latex allergies, so you're going to want to get gloves for your employees that are not some that are latex free, because again, about 13 to 20% of people have a latex allergy or can develop a latex allergy. So make sure that you've got gloves for those folks. All right. Also, don't reuse compromised gloves. You see on the TV, people have all these decontamination chambers, and they're deconning masks and they're deconning glasses. They're not deconning gloves, okay? Now, having a housekeeping plan is essential. So you come back, you're like, what do I do? What do I clean? Well, remember, there's cleaning and disinfecting. So clean. You want to clean high-touch areas, tables, doorknobs, light switches, countertops, handles, okay, desks, phones, keyboards, toilets, your mouse, faucets, sinks, places where people touch. It is so essential. Just remember, do a lot of people touch this? If the answer is yes, it needs to be cleaned and kept clean. Remember, you make dust with a feather duster, but if you dust with a feather duster, if you shake that feather duster and the dust gets loose and the virus molecules get loose, they can last up to 3 hours out in the air. So it's better to use something like a rag with a cleaner that will actually attract those particles and attach them to that rag. All right.
Andy,
Now,
2 minutes.
contaminated surfaces, it's important to remember that cleaning alone doesn't just do the job, okay? You need to clean, disinfect, sterilize. We talk about decontamination, right, and contaminated surfaces, but what exactly does that mean? Well, there's 3 steps to decontamination. There's cleaning, disinfecting, and sterilization. And healthcare facilities, they'll use all those in conjunction. Cleaning with soap and water, it removes dirt and impurities from surfaces and lowers the risk of spreading disease. Soap and water does a great job with this. Water is very polar. It has the ability to form hydrogen bonds. It's an excellent solvent that dissolves a lot of different kinds of molecule. And soap is a surfactant or surface active agent. It reduces water tension and it improves that solvency of water. So soap and water does a very good job. Disinfectants, a lot of your cleaning products will be cleaning products and disinfectants will kill viruses and bacteria on surfaces, okay? And they're stronger than sanitizers. But read the label, because a lot of these disinfectants, they work great, but they only work as disinfectants if you use them as disinfectants. So what does this mean? It means that sometimes you can clean with something, but if you're disinfecting with it, that means you're actually either keeping the surface wetter longer or taking a different action with that same cleaner. Sanitizers, they kill bacteria on surfaces, but not necessarily viruses.
Andy, we're just
Yes.
about at the end of your time.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm just about there.
Okay.
So remember things like receptacles with your trash cans, bale, bins, pails, things like that. They need to be cleaned and decontaminated on a regular basis. The best cleaner is bleach. Bleach does a great job. 1 part bleach with 5 parts of water directly dissolves the protein and breaks it down from the inside. There's a lot of different things you can use. You hear people talk about peroxides. Peroxides will kill the protein, but it's also can be very damaging to your skin. So you have to be very careful using that. Antibiotics don't work at all because it's not a living organism, right? Like a bacteria. Vinegar doesn't work because vinegar does not break down that protective layer of fat, okay? UV light will break the virus down, but remember, UV light does a great job dissolving proteins, but it can also break down collagen, which is a protein in your skin, and lead to wrinkles and skin cancer. Contaminated laundry, remember, when you're washing any contaminated laundry, whether it's tablecloths or anything else, wear gloves, never shake it, never shake any of those things, towels, gloves, bedding, any of that stuff, because the virus will cling to those surfaces and, it's inert, but it can last up to 3 hours, all right? So launder them using soap and water. Hot water is great and bleach is great. Now, before your folks come back to work, you need to train them. Talk about the things that we've talked about today and share a lot of this information with you, which I think will be available at the end of the program. So if you have any questions, we'll address those at the end of the program. We had a lot of information to get through, so thank you so much. And I'll turn it back over.
Thank you, Andy, for all that great information. Next, we're going to hear from Ed Musler, who's with our solid waste section of our Division of Waste Management. He's the section chief, and Ed will discuss solid waste considerations related to COVID-19.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for attending. It's a pleasure to help pass on this information. In the world of waste, it's not rocket science. So we've got some very simple guidance for people who have this, for residents, and if you're at home, if somebody's got it or suspected of it. The important thing is all of these things can be placed in your common household trash. So we recommend that you take your household trash, you place it in your sealed plastic bag, throw it in your regular garbage. It goes to a regular municipal solid waste landfill. Personal protective equipment, again, the same thing as we heard last time. You know, take those gloves off, anything you're not going to clean and reuse, place in a bag, and it can be sent to a landfill. Would be important to say that single-use gloves and masks should not be reused and should not go into the recycle bin. And a lot of times when we say don't put something in the recycle bin, it's not because the material is not recyclable, it's because it clogs up the equipment at the other end that's doing the recycling. And so those stretchy gloves and the masks with the elastics on it will clog it up, and we don't need to have our people working at those areas picking through that. So next slide, please. All right, go on, next slide, please. There we go. Okay, so the next slide is we've got businesses and healthcare facilities, and this is a little bit different because you may be subject to, as a regulated medical waste. Okay, so this guidance is specific for the use of disposal of waste that's used in the diagnosis, treatment, immunization, or handling of preparation of suspected or confirmed COVID-19 individuals, and let's not forget our animals. I do want to say that anything that we're recommending here is, of course, subject to change. Keep an eye out for what's most appropriate from the CDC, and also the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services is doing an outstanding job relaying information. How do you know whether you've got to worry about it? Well, there is a rule, and a generating facility generally is defined as any business, medical, or dental facility, a laboratory, a veterinarian hospital, or mortuaries. Next slide, please. Again, you know, personal protective equipment used in the diagnosis, treatment, immunization, or handling of these things should be placed in a tightly sealed bag, and it can be thrown in your garbage. It can also, some facilities don't want to make a distinction between what should and should not be sent for treatment, and so they put it in one bag and send it off to their medical waste treatment facility. The treatment facilities are handling those things that can transmit disease, tends to be fluids, bloody rags, parts, that type of thing. Sharps, those are your needles. They should be handled separately also. Sharps can be handled as it says here, they should be packaged. And generally what that means is putting it into a rigid container so that somebody can't accidentally get stuck with that needle. So you can do that and throw it away in a landfill, or many facilities send those on to their medical waste treatment facility, and they will handle them there. Next slide, please. Here's some resources that we've got available that you can get at. So they'll be available when you get this slide presentation. And next slide, please. And remember, the safest thing when dealing with all of this, when in doubt, throw it out. Bag it up, you know, once, don't shake it, don't do the things that we've just been told, and put it in your trash can. Down there, of course, is our website for the Division of Waste Management solid waste section, and we have complete things on medical waste and many of your recycling and trash questions. Next slide. And that was it for me. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions when we get to question and answer period. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ed, for that information. Next, we're going to hear from Jenny Patterson, who is an environmental program consultant with DEQ's Division of Waste Management, Hazardous Waste Section. She has worked with DEQ for 23 years, 17 of those being with Hazardous Waste Section. And the primary purpose of the Hazardous Waste Section is to ensure the proper and safe management and disposal of hazardous waste in North Carolina. Jenny, you should have presenter rights.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. And can you see my screen?
Yes. I think we can.
Okay, excellent. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. This next presentation will provide an overview of the management and disposal of hazardous wastes that may be generated as a result of increased cleaning at your facility. There are bonus slides included in your take-home version of this presentation, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into the extremely detailed information, and just be aware that neither of the presentations cover all of the hazardous waste rules and requirements, so please use this as guidance. Here is my contact information. And the hazardous waste rules are quite complicated, and today I am just touching on the very surface of these topics, so you are welcome to follow up with me if you have general questions, or please do not hesitate to contact the local hazardous waste section inspectors whose contact information and regions are shown on this map. If you need assistance, if you have site-specific questions, need assistance, or need confirmation with waste determinations. So I'm just going to jump right in. Throughout the presentation, I will address some of the frequent questions we're receiving about the management and disposal of hazardous waste generated as a result of cleaning. Here are some of the questions we're getting. When disposing of disinfectant or cleaning chemicals, how do I know if it's a hazardous waste? We're also getting the question, the cleaner I'm using is considered a pesticide. When disposed, is it a hazardous waste? And the waste I generated from cleaning is contaminated or suspected to be contaminated with COVID-19. Is it a hazardous waste? So all of those can be answered in one set of answers. And unfortunately, there is no single list of disinfectants and/or cleaning chemicals that may be considered hazardous waste. I have looked because I think that would make it very easy for folks. Just because it is a pesticide or the waste is contaminated with COVID-19 does not automatically make it a hazardous waste. And interestingly, there are not a lot of pesticides that fall into the hazardous waste jurisdiction. There are some. Often it is because the cleaner is ignitable or corrosive that will make it a hazardous waste, and not because of the pesticide component. And we'll talk a little more about that. Waste determination must be performed on any chemical waste, and it is solely the generator's responsibility to make this waste determination. So because it is such a big cornerstone of the hazardous waste program, and because there might be some folks out there that aren't familiar with the hazardous waste regulations, I wanted to give a very brief overview of how to make this hazardous waste determination, because it is really the key of the hazardous waste program. So very simply stated, hazardous waste is a waste that with properties that make it dangerous or capable of having a harmful effect on human health or the environment. Even with this very general definition, not all wastes will be considered a hazardous waste. Hazardous waste are very specifically defined, and what I'm doing is giving a very simple overview of the questions that are asked as far as doing a waste determination. So the first question is it a solid waste? A waste is a material that has been used or otherwise served its intended purpose, and for whatever reason, because it's contaminated or spent, can or no longer will be used for its intended purpose. So solid waste doesn't actually define the phase of the material. A solid waste can be solid, a liquid, a semi-solid, or a contained gas, and still be considered a solid waste. There are many materials that even when recycled will remain a solid waste. In very simple terms, if a cleaner or disinfectant can be used legitimately as is for its intended purpose, it is not a solid waste, so the hazardous waste rules would not apply. However, other rules would apply to a product, and of course you would want to always follow the instructions on the label for use. So the next questions I'm going to follow up in subsequent slides, but the questions include, the next question would be, is it excluded or exempt from regulation? Is it a characteristic hazardous waste? And then finally, is it a listed hazardous waste? So moving on to the, is it excluded from regulation? The way that you find that out is by reading through the regulations and comparing the material that you have to see if there's an exclusion that exists. Many of the exclusions are because the material is already regulated by another set of regulations, such as industrial wastewater that's subject to the Clean Water Act. So it's not regulated under the hazardous waste rules because it's already regulated under the Clean Water Act. Waste that meet the definition of hazardous but are generated from normal household operations fall under the household hazardous waste exclusion, and they're considered a solid waste but not a hazardous waste. And Ed touched on this in his presentation. So this is the reason why the same cleaner that you use at your house might have different requirements at work. So it's excluded at your house, but if it's generated at a business, different regulations would apply. And then two other exclusions that I'm going to touch on specifically in a little more detail are the solvent contaminated wipes exclusion and also residues from empty containers. So the next question in the series of 4 questions to make a waste determination is it a characteristic hazardous waste? And there are 4 characteristics. Again, this is extremely brief explanation about it. Ignitability is one of the characteristics, and that is a liquid with a flash point of less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit. It could be not a liquid and capable of causing a fire through friction, absorption of moisture, or spontaneous chemical changes. It could be a compressed gas or an oxidizer. The second characteristic is corrosivity, and it would be a liquid with a pH less than or equal to 2 or greater than or equal to 12.5. It can also be a liquid that corrodes steel at a rate of more than 1/4 of an inch per year. These are the 2 characteristics that are most likely going to be carried by a waste cleaner or disinfectant. These are probably the most common. Another characteristic is reactivity, where it spontaneously reacts with air or water, and toxicity, which is measured by performing a very specific test, a toxicity characteristic leaching procedure, and then compared to 40 parameters and certain concentration limits that are set in the regulations. Hopefully cleaners that are used to clean or disinfect will not carry a reactivity or toxicity characteristic, but they might, and it's important to evaluate all of the hazards and review the material to make sure it does or doesn't have one of these characteristics. In addition, a lot of folks are thinking about pesticides because some of the cleaners are considered pesticides. I just wanted to point out that that there are very few pesticides, and these are the ones that would be considered hazardous waste as far as toxicity. Now, we do have some others that are P&U listed waste that will be on your bonus slides, and some more information is provided about that. But to put it in perspective as far as pesticides, here are the ones that, or components of pesticides that would be considered hazardous waste. Most of these are discontinued in the United States, so it wouldn't be something that would be in your cleaner anyway. As an aside, the safety data sheets for cleaners and commercial chemical products are very useful, typically in determining the ignitability, because it'll often provide a flash point, and also the pH. It is not always very helpful in determining the toxicity, because OSHA regulations do not require manufacturers to identify constituents present at certain concentrations, so the product may actually contain a toxicity characteristic constituent above RCRA regulatory requirements that doesn't have to be identified in the safety data sheet. So just be aware of that as you're using safety data sheets to help make a waste determination. I've also found that it's really frustrating using a safety data sheet, and you probably have too, when you look at it and the disposal considerations have a very general statement along the lines of dispose of in accordance with all applicable federal, state, and local regulations. So that is very frustrating in making that waste determination. So finally, the last question in the set of 4 to make a waste determination is it listed? And the way that you determine listings is because of the process or the chemical, and you compare it to lists that exist in the regulations. And you can't test for a listing, you just compare it to see if it is actually on the list. Typically, cleaners would not, cleaners used for this purposes, industrial cleaners might fall under an F listing, but typically the cleaners that are used for sanitizing or disinfecting would be perhaps in a P or U listing, but maybe not. Some of the newer cleaners might not even be listed when disposed of. So once a waste determination is made, if the waste is determined to be hazardous, the next steps are to determine how much is generated in a calendar month and then follow appropriate management requirements applicable to that hazardous waste generation category. So this is a chart that actually shows the thresholds for the different types of generation categories and the limits that can be generated to remain in those categories. So that was a super quick explanation. Again, you can contact your hazardous waste inspectors if you need to discuss this specifically. There are often materials that are thought to be a hazardous waste that are not, and thank you very much, Ed, for discussing medical waste. Sometimes people think that that is under the hazardous waste jurisdiction, and then some other materials that aren't typically a hazardous waste unless they're mixed with hazardous waste. Another question that we're getting concerns empty containers that held cleaning products. What do I do with this empty container that held the cleaning product? If it meets the standard for an empty container under 40 CFR 261, it can be placed in the trash. And there are actually very specific requirements to meet the 40 CFR 261 requirements to have a RCRA empty container. First, you'd want to check to make sure that that container didn't hold an acutely hazardous waste. If it did, it's got to be triple rinsed prior to it being considered empty. A lot of folks won't go through that process because you'll generate a lot more hazardous waste by triple rinsing, so they'll just dispose of the container itself as a hazardous waste. Otherwise, for containers less than 119 gallons, when all waste is removed that can be removed by employing commonly employed practices like pumping, pouring, spraying out of the can, and that and is very important, no more than an inch remains in the bottom of the container. That is when the container of non-acute hazardous waste would be considered empty. And then for compressed gases, when the pressure in the container approaches atmospheric. So again, because these are very specific, you could check with your inspector to ensure that containers that you're claiming to be RCRA empty are truly RCRA empty, and they could help with that confirmation. Another just note and aside is, even if it's non-hazardous, there are some prohibitions to putting liquids in North Carolina solid waste landfills. So even if you make the determination that it's non-hazardous, be aware that there are other prohibitions. And of course, hazardous waste is not allowed in the landfill. So an exclusion would have to apply for that waste to be able to go to the landfill. Something that I've noticed when you're using wipes, have you noticed, like when you use a disinfecting wipe, a lot of times when you get to the bottom of the container, there's a lot of liquid at the bottom of the container. If you can use that material for its intended purpose, it wouldn't be a waste. So what I've thought of, and maybe this would work, is sometimes when you start a new container, they're really dry at the top. So what if you poured that same material onto the top of the wipes? You're using it for its intended purpose. You also have an empty container after you pour it onto the next container of wipes.
Jenny?
Yes.
You have about 2 minutes for your
Oh
section.
my goodness. Okay, so I am going
Sorry.
to speed through these. Another question that we're getting is, I've got extra cleaning products or they've expired. What do I do with them? Well, what I would suggest is if you can't use them for their intended purpose, try to find someone else who can legitimately use them as is for their intended purpose. The North Carolina Waste Trader site might be a useful resource to help connect with someone that could use it for its intended purpose. And if it's unused commercial chemical product that you can't find another home for, there might be some reclamation outlets to keep it from being a hazardous waste. So check in with us and we can assist with explaining the regulations on how to keep that out of hazardous waste regulations. Another question is, I am using disinfecting wipes or cleaning wipes for cleaning at my facility. Can I manage those under the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion? Maybe, and there's more on the next slides, and I might not have time to go over them, but you will have all of the information that you need to explore this option. But I will tell you this, that if the wipe is contaminated only with an ignitable solvent, such as isopropyl alcohol, which is probably something that has been used often as a disinfectant, and the ignitable solvent isn't also listed, consider just performing a waste determination and managing it as a non-hazardous waste instead of by this conditional exclusion. And then I can also tell you that if the wipe is contaminated with a corrosive cleaner like a bleach, the exclusion won't apply, so you don't even need to think about it. Because of for sake of time, there are many slides that deal with the solvent contaminated wipe rule. If it's okay with you, Marcia, I might just turn control back over to you and not go into those, and I can answer some of the questions during the Q&A session.
Sure, yeah, I'll take it back from you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny, for all that information. Also joining us today and up on the screen is information from John Petrone. He is also with the Division of Waste Management Solid Waste Section, and he is the staff member that specializes in medical waste. He's been with DEQ for 20 years in roles dealing with public water supply, Division of Air Quality, and solid waste regulation. I just wanted to let everyone know that John is happy to answer any questions during our Q&A session. In addition to what Ed has already provided, there's links to medical waste regulations, also a presentation on medical waste if the audience needs that. Okay. Finally, we're going to have David Lipton who is an industrial hygiene consultant with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services Division of Public Health. He is a certified industrial hygienist by the American Board of Industrial Hygiene since 1990. And David's areas of expertise is indoor environmental air quality, specifically related to dampness and mold growth. And he provides subject matter expertise regarding water management plans to prevent Legionnaire's disease. So, David, I'm going to advance to the next slide and you can chat for a few minutes.
Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. I hope you guys can hear me. I did hit the unmute button.
Yes, we can hear you.
When we talk about cleaning, we like to think of it as a truly an environmental management process. Of course, the one thing that I didn't put up there is obviously if you can prevent contaminants from getting indoors, that's the best thing in this situation, since people might be asymptomatic and still shedding virus. That's not necessarily feasible, but we want people to think of it a process where you identify and capture and contain and remove and dispose of contaminants, pollutants, whatever they might be. This actually came from a book written in 1994 by Michael Berry called Cleaning for Health. He did a lot of research at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Center in Chapel Hill on all this stuff. The other part is that you want to leave minimal amounts of residues of the contaminants, the cleaning agents, and also water, which is a common product. So we want people to think about that as they're developing their plans. The two hyperlinks are actually a combination of materials from the EPA and CDC about reopening America guidance for workplaces, public spaces, all that place, and also a cleaning and disinfection tool. And they're pretty simple. They say develop a plan, implement a plan, maintain and revise a plan. They are missing the fourth element, which I think is one that's really crucial, and that is communicate. So the first thing that I would say is that if you're using any disinfecting product, read the label before you use it and figure out, can you really use it following the label instructions? The label on disinfectants, they're called antimicrobial pesticides. They're a subset of pesticides. That label is a legal document. So for example, I have some Clorox wipes that don't contain bleach, but in order to get a disinfectant activity, you got to keep the surface visibly wet for 10 minutes. So if you can't do that, that's not an appropriate product. Other disinfectants have different dwell times, but you need to really read the label. And I would say the label, having the labels available is probably more important than having the safety data sheet in terms of figuring out how to use those products effectively. I think the other part of communicating is when you develop your plan, there are lots of things that can be cleaned and will be just fine. So not every surface needs to be disinfected. The EPA and the CDC and NIOSH all discourage broad spraying of antimicrobial pesticides all over surfaces. What's the point of that? You're adding a chemical residue to the environment. We also think that there's all sorts of people that occupy a building. And so when you're developing your plan, you want to think about who's doing what and also who's not doing what. So, for example, in our office building that's a rental space, the custodian is taking care of all the high touch points that are owned or managed by our building or by the owner. But they're not doing anything, say, with copy machines, with the touch points on the microwave oven or the refrigerator. There's all sorts of places that we're touching that they're not dealing with. So it takes communication, and it can get even more complex in a multi-employer environment or in a complex environment like a school. So I think that the important part is thinking through the plan, communicating the plan, making sure that people are all on the same page about what needs to be cleaned, what needs to be disinfected, and then picking the right product and following the label instructions. And really, that's about all I've got to say. I think the EPA guidance and the CDC guidance on those hyperlinks is a really good starting point, and maybe keeping it simple might be a better way to approach this rather than getting down into the weeds.
Okay, thank you.
That was short and sweet. I didn't really have much else to say.
Okay, so
Read the label.
There we go, read the label. So we're going to transition into our Q&A section. That is going to be led by Scott Pfister and assisted by Angela Barger, both of DEQ's non-regulatory Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service. And I've seen lots of questions being typed in, but just a reminder, you can ask your questions by typing them into the questions box in the webinar toolbar. And Scott and Angela will be directing those to our participants. Okay, all right. And I'm just going to put this slide, splash slide up. I just want to note we did have about 475 registrants, so we anticipate a large number of questions. We're going to do our best to answer those within our allotted time, but we will follow up with everyone if there are any unanswered questions, and we will be creating an FAQ segment on the website that we create. Scott and Angela.
All right, thank you so much, Marcia, and thanks so much to the panelists and presenters. I know this is a very serious subject, and we're trying to get as many of these questions answered as possible. So with that being said, we'll jump right into it. The first question, it actually Terry, who is one of our organizers as well, might be able to shed some light on this. But I think, Andy, if you could assist us with this first one. Essentially, there's two questions, but I'll wrap them up dealing with HVAC systems. If your HVAC system, if you know if it has a HEPA filter or a type of UV filter, as you said before, the virus isn't really alive, so kill is not quite the right word, but does it break the UV light? Does it break it down? And what do we do with those HEPA filters?
Okay, sure. So, at this point, if you're using like just, filters exclusively, there's really no direct scientific evidence of a benefit from that, especially when you're talking about things that are like low efficiency filters, like less than like MERV 8. That's pretty unlikely to make any difference. However, a high efficiency filter, if it's properly fitted, is going to block out quite a bit of particles. If you look at, but again, there's no scientific basis for saying yay or nay or giving you a positive reading of like, oh, it's going to cut out 63.7%. We don't have anything like that because nobody's really done those kinds of studies. Now, hospitals have to face these problems all the time. So with hospitals, they use a combination of these things. They'll use HEPA filters, UV lamps, humidity control, airflow management. They've got staffs of engineers that actually work there and control these systems, and they're generally very good. For just a general office building, or replacing your filters, will that help? Certainly, but is it proven to really help that much? No, there's really no evidence to sustain that. However, when you are changing filters, you probably want to take a little bit of extra care because they are going to have a lot of dust and dirt and so on them, if nothing more because these buildings have sat idle for quite a while, and so they're liable to collect a lot more, a lot faster. Anything like that, again, if you let it sit for 7 days without outside sources, the virus is going to be inert and disintegrate in that amount of time, regardless of what media that it's sitting on. So hopefully that helps.
If I can cut in, this is David Lipton. We have periodically gotten questions about, should I fog my heating and air conditioning system? And the answer to that is no. First of all, that's a pesticide. If you are going to do that, you've got to pick an antimicrobial product that is approved for the inside of heating and air conditioning systems. And they have a lot of soft surfaces for gaskets and interior insulation, so that's a problem right there. Most products are only good for hard surfaces. The other question is, how are you going to get enough of the product into the system in order to reach every surface with enough dwell time to actually do disinfecting? And the answer is that's a hard thing to do. So we do not recommend fogging heating and air conditioning systems in these situations.
Great, David, Andy, thank you so much. So the next question, and I think this is just a really, really important point I know is touched upon, but I don't think there's any harm in talking about it again. So David, since you're the last one there to talk, what's the difference again between disinfecting and sanitizing?
That's a really good question. I think technically, say in food service, I'm not really, well, I work with environmental health people a lot, but in environmental health, you clean to get rid of the residues, then you sanitize. So sanitize basically is a reduction of the microbial contaminants on a surface to some sort of safe level. So washing your dishes and air drying them or dipping them in bleach or using 140-degree water and then letting them air dry. That's sanitizing. That doesn't mean that there might not be a few bacteria that land on the surface, but they're not going to amplify or whatever. Disinfecting is actually a higher level of chemical activity or physical activity where you are physically degrading the microorganism or inactivating it. That's a good answer.
Okay, great, thank you. And just a follow-up to that, since we were looking at those definitions, we've had a couple questions about isopropyl alcohol or IPA versus ethanol. If you're going to compare the two, which one is better for sanitizing or disinfecting? And there's also another question about 99.9% IPA, not the beer, isopropyl alcohol. So David or Andy, if either of you could answer that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I know with, when we talk about alcohols, ethanol versus isopropanol, I mean, we're talking about the carbonyls that are, attached to the OH group, the alcohol itself. So with that, again, our alcohol level, what we're looking for is 65%. It's the concentration. So if you're using something like anhydrous alcohol, 99.9% alcohol, man, it's kind of overkill. Certainly it will work, absolutely. But keep in mind, it is extremely flammable too. And so you have to obviously take some precautions using that. And again, all of these things, regardless of what alcohol level you're using. When you're using something like hand sanitizer is formulated so that, yes, it has 65% or greater alcohol, but the reason it's kind of slimy and gooey is it has moisturizers for your hands, because anytime that you're handling strong solvents, you're going to naturally defat your skin. So that's something to keep in mind. So, if you grab a bottle of anhydrous alcohol and just start scrubbing away with it, will that work? Absolutely. Can you do damage to your skin? Absolutely. Unless you're wearing, appropriate PPE for that.
Great, thank you, Andy. This next question goes to Jenny, and or if Ed or John want to add to it, but specifically to Jenny. Can you clarify how used bleach wipes are to be managed?
Good morning, this is Jenny. I'll be happy to take that or start with that question. So the bleach wipes, as long as there are no free liquids, the hazardous waste definition doesn't have corrosive waste. Waste that is a solid that is also corrosive doesn't fall into the definition of hazardous waste. So it would have to be a liquid in order for it to meet our definition as a hazardous waste. So if during use it no longer has free liquids in it, which typically is the case, it'll dry out as you're using it. As long as there are no other hazardous waste characteristics and that material is not listed, it would just be a solid waste. And one point, I had one more slide and I totally forgot to show it, but it was about not flushing any wipes. So regardless of whether or not they're hazardous, non-haz, or otherwise, the slide said do not flush them under any circumstances. And it's because the wipes weren't designed to be flushed, and also the sewer system was not designed to receive these types of materials, and it'll clog it, and it'll be very expensive to fix that clogged sewer line. However, back to the wipe, it is very likely that those would just be a solid waste and could be put in the trash, but you'd want to be aware of any of the free liquid that's coming off of it, because that is what would cause it to be a hazardous waste.
Great, thank you, Jenny. That was going to be my follow-up question, is for you to talk about not flushing those. And you also had in a comment here a kudos on the taking that remainder liquid and kind of pouring it into the next one. So kudos for that. So the next question here is going back up to Andy. So there's a couple folks, it was interesting, that came in right at the same time, of masks that say K as in kilo, KN95 masks. They're just wondering if those were knockoffs or was that a different definition?
No, that's a great question. There are different, in this country, we use N, P, and R, which talk about oil resistance. So either none, partially resistant, or oil proof. It's 99, percent oil proof. But with the KN, a lot of times we'll see filters from Europe or from Asia will have a different designation. And as far as I know, which, from what I've seen and the research I've done, the KN is fine. You can use that in place of a N95, certainly within the workplace and all, but because of our severe shortages, they've made allotments for that. So yes, KN95 is essentially an N95. It's just, it meets a foreign standard, which is the same as our standard. It's just not the OSHA standard. But it's the same standard. It's just written in a different country.
Okay, great. And this next one, Jenny, Ed, or John, it's sort of it's more in the waste realm, in the liquid type. I know defining solid and liquid waste, there's specific definitions, but with a lot of organizations mopping or steaming carpets and shampooing and, just doing generally more cleaning and creating specifically those types of liquid wastes. Do you have any guidance, suggestions? I know that's kind of another part of our house here in DEQ, but any tips on what to do with that dirty water, or if a consultant or a contractor comes in to do that work, what should they do with that dirty water?
Generally speaking, this is John. Generally speaking, it's my understanding that just everyday household or business cleaning of floors and countertops, etc., the liquids can go down the commode or sink down to the sanitary sewer system.
That's correct. Thank you for that, John. This is Ed. I think large consultants or specialists who generate large volumes of water, such as cleaners or carpet cleaners or car cleaners, generally have to dispose of that water under normal circumstances. So they would have some sort of industrial waste discharge place that they would take it, and they would have to check with wherever they're discharging. But in general, those things being handled in the wastewater system is appropriate. You certainly wouldn't want to dump them on the ground if they contain any significant cleaner or hazardous material. So we don't want to get that in the groundwater, and we certainly don't want to kill anything with it. But just use common sense and flush it.
Definitely, yeah. We don't want to cause more problems downstream with some of our efforts here. So this next question will go to David, and it's definitely a very real one, and I'm sure it's very important to the person who's asked it as well as those listening. What steps should be taken if someone at our facility has been diagnosed with COVID-19?
That's a really good question. I think that, sorry, I'm having to gather my breath. I think that first of all, if it's done by testing, the local health department will be probably calling you and beginning to do a contact tracing to figure out who might have been exposed. I think the place where internally, I think the place where the person was, you definitely want to do enhanced cleaning of that work area. From there, I think in a lot of ways it becomes a medical management issue, and it depends on what kind of exposure you had. In a lot of places, they keep an exposure log. They ask the people that have been exposed to self-monitor their symptoms for a week or two, and especially taking temperature and thinking about the other symptoms. And then they let them come back to work. I think especially as we start to reopen, from what I understand that the health departments will be emphasizing the idea of contact tracing and then following the patterns in terms of the workplace. I think a careful cleaning and disinfecting of surfaces that you know where the person was at or might have touched is probably the best way to go on that.
Great, thank you, David. This next question, actually we had a couple of them in here in the queue, is directed towards Andy. And just wanting to see if you could comment on the use of electrostatic sprayers for covering large areas. And they gave some examples of conference rooms, classrooms, auditoriums, etc., versus going in and really wiping these areas down by hand.
Well, here's the thing. Well, if it's an electrostatic spray, I mean, essentially what that's doing is when you are spraying it, you're breaking down that bond. So the particles released. So that's great. But the problem is that if you're not there to collect it, again, it's just like using a filter or a feather duster, right? The more you stir it up, the worse it is. The more you contain it, the better it is. One of the things we always talk about in OSHA, especially with dust collection, right? Somebody works covered with dust head to toe. So what do? They take a hose and then they spray themselves off. They create a massive dust cloud and that dust just goes everywhere. Better way to do it is use a vacuum, get rid of the dust, and just, now you can dispose of it rather than redistributing it. When you go in and you're cleaning a surface, you're removing dirt and dust particles. And then that allows you to get down when you're actually doing the disinfecting and cleaning it. So a lot of people out there make a lot of claims. I've seen tons of people out there, on these new commercials and stuff, right, where they're walking around with backpacks and, they're spraying things like they were spraying crops with insecticide. There's a lot of different things out there. A lot of different, folks are pushing a lot of different products. I would look at the company, how long they've been in business, what they do, read reviews, and pay attention and see. Nothing beats good old-fashioned cleaning, right? Meaning taking a rag, taking some sort of disinfectant or soap and water and cleaning that surface, and then you can rest assured that it's in good shape. You can go in and spray a bunch of stuff just like people will go and spray Lysol, but it's the only way to really be sure is to actually clean it. There's not, really an easy answer for that. Now, a lot of people have asked, oh, I'm sorry. I mean, I was just going to follow up with that is, a lot of folks have asked about in areas, say like in manufacturing, right? If I've got a manufacturing facility and, I've got all these pieces of equipment and all these things, and I'm building stuff and making stuff and so on, what do I need to clean? Because it's a massive amount of stuff. And you're right, it is. If you've got, say, let's just use an example. Let's say you've got a saw and you're using that saw to cut wood. Maybe it's a radial arm saw, right? You just pull it across and you're just rough cutting wood. what you have to ask yourself is, what are people touching in that process? Are they touching the blade? I hope not. I mean, otherwise you're going to have a lot of other issues, right, with cut digits. But they are touching the handle. Okay, great, clean the handle. They're touching the trigger, turn it on, clean that. They're touching the switch to switch the power to the power grid, clean that. Clean everything, but really, really, really clean and disinfect the things that people are touching the most. That's really going to be the thing. Think about, we talk about contact tracing, right? We want to see the people this person has come in contact with. Think of the same thing with surfaces. If that sick person or that potentially contaminated person came in, or any person, what are they most likely to touch when they come into that building? First thing is a handle. Next thing is a light switch. Next thing is a doorknob. Next thing is, something else. Think of it like that, like a process, and then, base your cleaning, a lot of your cleaning on that. Like I said, if you shut your door on, say, March 31st, and you're going back to work, on May 8th, and nobody's been in that building, you really are not going to have anything to do other than just general cleaning, because everything, any type of coronavirus, regardless of what it is, common cold or COVID-19, is going to be dead. It'll be disintegrated in that, that amount of time. If it's been 7 days or more, then, there's really not a whole lot to do other than just general cleaning.
Great, thank you for that, Andy, and thanks for the follow-up to your own. And speaking of follow-up, we have some really just very valuable attendees here on this webinar as well. There's two follow-ups, and the last one actually, Marcia, could use some of your insight on as well. But the first one, an attendee mentioned in relation to our very first question about HVAC units. ASHRAE, which is an amazing resource for all things energy and HVAC related, as well as other things. And we can share that resource post recording as well. But they have some great guidance on those types of filtration and lots of data as well. The second follow-up, and again, we're just trying to give some good general guidance in terms of the wastewater. There's so many technicalities in that, but the attendee definitely said to make sure to check the SDS, which I think we've mentioned many times. All of our panelists said read the instructions first, right? But it is good to check when you're disposing of wastewaters with your public utility. And I didn't know if Marcia, if you could add to that.
Sure, no, that was a great highlight. And unfortunately, folks, we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but as I stated before, we will be following up with everyone. And so one of our industrial facilities highlighted that you need to be careful about what you're putting down your drain that's going to go to that publicly owned treatment works, or POTW. So remember, your POTW is watching out for the different chemicals that come to you. If you're one of their larger users, they may ask you to complete a survey to find out what are the types of wastewater you're going to be sending to them. But if they see, with everyone doing some increased cleaning, that they're getting a higher, what we call a loading, or a higher concentration of the pollutants that come to the wastewater treatment plant, they may look into their collection system, which are the pipes that convey the wastewater from your facility to theirs, to look and see, is there someone sending, a really concentrated load to them that may upset the bugs and the creatures at the wastewater treatment plant, that cleans that water and allows them to then discharge that back out to our surface water so it's clean for everyone to use. So great comments. So with that, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. As you exit, we're going to ask you to fill out a survey and give us some feedback that allows us to improve our technical assistance programs and make sure that we are offering information on the topics that you want to hear about and that you're interested in. As I noted in the beginning, you're going to be receiving a copy of the recording and a copy of the presentation slides, and we'll be sending that to the registered email. I just wanted to highlight, there's, Jenny noted she's got some extra slides in there. There are also going to be some extra slides from the Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service about our free regulatory technical assistance programs that we can assist you with. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, and everyone have a great rest of your day.